In a big legal story we've been following, a parole board has denied notorious murderer and serial rapist Paul Bernardo's bid for freedom. Bernardo is serving a life sentence for kidnapping, rape, and first-degree murder of two teen girls, Leslie Mahaffey and Kristen French. Of course, in the early 1990s, a story that made international headlines. He was designated a dangerous offender and has been eligible for parole since February. He's now 54 years old. He appeared at a parole hearing today. His lawyer argued that he has improved himself during 25 years in prison. Bernardo told the board that he cries every day over the crimes that he committed and promised that he would not reoffend. The board is now required to review Paul Bernardo's case every 2 years moving forward. But again, the parole board denying parole to Paul Bernardo. We've got CTV legal analyst Ed Prutschi here in studio for some immediate reaction to this. Surprised, not surprised?
No, not surprised. Obviously, I think a lot of Canadians are gasping a big sigh of relief right now. This is what anybody would have expected to happen. I'm sure this is what Bernardo expected to happen. I'm sure this is what Bernardo's lawyer expected to happen. But the process had to happen. And so, there are people who will complain about the process, but this is what it is. So the mountain that he had to climb was just so high that I'm not remotely surprised that this is where we ended up.
He's at Millhaven, of course, in the Kingston area. Your take on, he was eligible for parole as of February. Now it's going to be every 2 years. Your take on what you saw today, what was said by the defense. Give us your sort of deep dive on that.
Yeah, so look, the defense's focus was on the very narrow issue. They tried to constrain it as much as possible and just say, this is all about, is he safe to return to society? It's a question of public safety. And what they said is he's been in custody for over 2 decades now. There's been no issues while he's been in custody. The timing of this parole hearing, you referenced to the fact that this had been adjourned a couple of times and he was actually eligible earlier in February. That was not an accident. He was the one adjourning that because he was actually facing charges for being in possession of a shiv. And so it was important that he deal with that and ultimately had those charges withdrawn. So that can't be held against him in any way. But he didn't want to go up in front of the parole board with that black mark hanging over his head. So he goes in clean, and I put that sort of in air quotes, as clean as a person with his background and his known convictions could be. So, how much can you say about that? He expressed remorse, he expressed the tears, and he talked about the monstrosity about what he did. But you can't help but immediately respond when he says, I cry every night thinking about this, to saying, you cry? Well, so do the French and Mahaffey families. So do all the women who were raped by the Scarborough rapist, which is, of course, you. So probably does the judge who decades ago had to watch these videos. So many people were impacted by this case that there's no running away from that.
It strikes me as well that itself is part of all this, the sort of unique nature of this case, the crimes that were committed, the headlines it generated, the outrage as well, and the people were watching this story so closely.
Yeah, it was incredibly closely watched. Not just in Canada. This had a massive international dimension. I remember as a law student, you had U.S. networks lining up, and this whole question about, in Canada, we have these quaint publication bans that we think are very, very important to preserve the integrity of the jury pool, and the jury is going to be hearing it. Well, the Americans in international media didn't care all that much about that, so they were perfectly happy to report all the gruesome details and sort of move forward on that. So it was almost tried in a different time, and yet time has not really moved on. One of the families, I think it was Ms. Mahaffey, in her victim impact statement, talked about how people say the cliche, time heals all wounds. And she said, no, it doesn't. It doesn't in the circumstance of these families.
So what happens now?
So, now not much. I think the thing that people are most concerned about is that now it triggers this automatic, as you indicated in that intro, this automatic renewal where every 2 years we get this macabre anniversary where he's going to be back. Unless he makes a decision to waive that right, the parole board has an obligation to hear and rehear every 2 years for the rest of his life, because this is a life sentence. Will at some point, 2 years, 8 years, 25 more years down the line, there be a change in circumstance? It's hard to say. My inclination and my gut would be that he's still never going to see the light of day, but he's going to have the opportunity to make this pitch many more times.
And every time he has to go back, of course, the families will be brought back in as well.
So the families will certainly be informed, and they are entitled to come back in. They're not required to come back, but as we've seen with these families, they are very, very engaged. They've been engaged from the moment of the initial trial decades ago. And so, to say that they wanted to be here is perhaps a bit of a stretch. They obviously didn't want to be here. They spoke of not wanting to be in in the same room as Bernardo, but I think they feel almost a magnetic pull that they can't turn away. They can't not be a part of it. They seem to see it as their responsibility to their departed loved ones. I don't think anybody would begrudge them if they said, I just can't do this anymore. So, I'll mail it in, I'll write something down, but I don't want to come in person. That's not the way these families have responded, and I think we have to respect that.
How difficult is that? I mean, you have, worked in this industry, in the law industry for a long time as a lawyer. I mean, when families go through that?
Look, I can tell you personally, it's very, very hard. I've done cases where I know that the family of the victim of a client of mine, if I'm doing a sentencing hearing, is sitting behind me, either at a hearing or in court. And you can feel, even if it's not really happening, I certainly feel the burn in the back of my head from people looking at me because I'm here to represent that individual. And you have to do this kind of bifurcated professional analysis and say, look, I've got a job to do and it's very difficult. And you do it in a respectful way and you focus on the law. And I think that's been the case in the Bernardo scenario. He's always been represented by very good and fair counsel. There was no circus made out of this trial. There was no circus made out of this parole board hearing. So you haven't seen, I think, anything inappropriate. You've seen a process that is very difficult for lots of parties to go through, and you've seen that process unfold exactly the way it should.
All right, Ed Prutschi with the very latest for us. Thanks for this, Ed.
You're welcome.